The steakhouse went silent the moment the words cut through the air. "Sir, you're not welcome here. Leave before we call security." It wasn't whispered. It wasn't discreet. The waiter made sure every table heard it. Forks froze in midair. Glasses hovered just before lips. And conversations died like candles snuffed out by a sudden gust of wind. At the doorway stood a frail old man, dripping from the storm outside. His coat was soaked through, heavy with rain, his shoes leaving muddy prints on the polished marble. In his trembling hands, he clutched a faded military cap. His eyes searched the room, desperate for a trace of kindness. But all he found were cold stares and raised brows. I just wanted to sit down. Just for a minute, he muttered, his voice thin and cracked. The host leaned forward, lips curled in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is not a shelter, sir. You need to go." The words landed like a slap. Some guests chuckled quietly, hiding their smirks behind napkins. Others avoided eye contact altogether, pretending to study their menus. No one moved. No one helped. The old man lowered his gaze, humiliated. He twisted his cap in his hands, as though it might somehow shield him from the cruelty pressing in on all sides. His shoulders hunched, his spirit shrinking under the weight of 1,000 judgments. And then, movement, from the farthest corner of the room, where a group of 6 broad-shouldered men sat in silence. A glass touched the table with a deliberate clink. One of them pushed his chair back, the scrape echoing like thunder in the stillness. He rose slowly, power coiled in every deliberate motion. The scar along his jaw caught the dim light, and the insignia tattooed on his wrist was unmistakable. Trident and anchor. Navy SEAL. The waiter's face drained of color. His voice faltered. But before he could speak, another man from the same table stood, and then another, until all 6 of them were on their feet, silent, immovable, eyes locked on the fragile figure at the entrance. The energy in the room shifted. The laughter, the arrogance, the false superiority, all of it evaporated. What replaced it was a tension so thick you could feel it in your chest. The waiter stepped back, suddenly small, as though the floor beneath him had opened and revealed the truth he'd tried to bury. He had judged a man not by his story, but by his appearance. The old man blinked in confusion, unaware of the storm he had stirred. For him, it was just another night of rejection. But for the 6 warriors rising in silence, it was something else entirely. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The silence was suffocating. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it grips every chest, tightens every throat. The 6 Navy SEALs stood like monuments, carved out of stone, unshakable, unyielding. The waiter swallowed hard, his false confidence crumbling as quickly as the smirk had vanished from his lips. His hand, the same one that had pointed at the door just seconds ago, now trembled slightly, uncertain where to rest. He looked to the host for backup, but the host had already retreated into the shadows, suddenly fascinated with the reservation list in front of him. One of the SEALs broke the silence, not with a shout, not with anger, but with a voice so steady it cut sharper than any blade. He strode forward, boots echoing on the marble, each step heavier than the last. His eyes never left the old man. "Sir," he said firmly, but with a reverence no one in the room had shown before. "Are you Staff Sergeant Raymond Douglas?" The old man's head jerked up. His lips parted in disbelief, as though someone had just spoken his name from another lifetime. "Yes," he whispered, voice cracking. "I was a long time ago." The SEAL froze, snapped to attention, and lifted his hand in a salute so sharp it sliced the air. "It's an honor, Sergeant." The restaurant gasped in unison, a collective intake of breath. People leaned forward in their chairs, phones half raised but frozen, unsure if recording this moment would be disrespectful. Another SEAL stood straighter, eyes locked on the waiter. "You judged him by his coat," he said in a low growl, "not by his courage." The waiter stammered, words tripping over themselves. I didn't know. He didn't, he didn't say. The first SEAL cut him off, stepping closer, his presence towering. You didn't ask. The words dropped like a gavel in a courtroom, final and undeniable. Then something remarkable happened. One of the SEALs gently touched the old man's arm. You're not leaving, Sergeant. You're dining with us. Tears filled the old man's eyes, trembling in the dim light. You boys don't have to do that. Yes, we do, the SEAL replied without hesitation, because you did it for us first. The hostess rushed forward, hands shaking as she cleared a chair at the SEAL's table. But instead of seating him quietly, the men guided Raymond to the head of the table. Not beside them, not behind them, at the head, as if he were their commanding officer, as if he were a king. The old man resisted at first, embarrassed, murmuring, Please, I don't want to cause trouble. But his protests fell away the moment he looked into their eyes. There was no pity there, no charity, only brotherhood. Other guests whispered, some lowering their heads in shame, others blinking back tears. A few had the courage to clap softly, the sound awkward but growing, until it rippled across the room like a tide. The restaurant that had rejected him now bent to the weight of respect he had carried all along. The waiter had disappeared, swallowed by his own humiliation. The host stood frozen, guilt etched into every line of his face. But the focus was no longer on them. It was on the frail soldier who, for one brief night, became the most honored man in the room. As Raymond sat, the SEAL who first spoke leaned down, his voice low but charged with meaning. Tonight, Sergeant, you don't eat alone. You eat with family. The old man's hands shook as he set his cap on the table. His voice broke again, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from something he hadn't felt in decades, belonging. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. No longer was this a story about an outcast being shown the door. It was about a forgotten warrior being restored to his throne. The head of the table had never looked so sacred. Raymond Douglas, frail and rain-soaked, was lowered into the chair as if he were being seated on a throne. The 6 Navy SEALs stood around him, not as men indulging charity, but as warriors guarding their king. The old man tried to protest again. Please, I don't belong here. I don't want to make trouble. The scarred SEAL leaned in, voice like iron. You belong more than anyone in this room. Tonight, Sergeant, this table is yours. The words cracked something inside Raymond. His hands trembled as he set his faded cap down, not at his side, but right in front of him, like a banner planted in conquered ground. The waiter stumbled forward, still shaken, his apology spilling out in broken fragments. I didn't realize. I'm sorry, sir. One SEAL turned to him, eyes like steel. You judged him by his coat, he growled. Not by his courage. The waiter's face flushed red. He backed away, his shame burning hotter than any rebuke, and the moment he vanished into the shadows, the dining room shifted. The spotlight was no longer on polished suits, expensive wines, or whispered deals. It was on a man who had once walked through jungles with nothing but a rifle and the weight of a nation on his back. The SEALs settled into their chairs, flanking him like loyal sentries. The noise of the restaurant returned, but it was different now, softer, reverent, as if the walls themselves understood they were sheltering a story too sacred to mock. For a while, Raymond didn't speak. He simply stared at the linen tablecloth, tracing the pattern with calloused fingers. His silence was not awkward. It was heavy, thick with ghosts. Finally, one of the SEALs broke it, his voice low. Tell us, Sergeant. Tell us about Vietnam. The old man hesitated, then exhaled, a sound weary with decades. Vietnam, he whispered, as if the name itself carried the weight of 1,000 nights. He began slowly, like a man reopening wounds he thought had long scarred over. The jungle was never quiet. Never. You'd hear insects, rain, whispers in the leaves that might have been the wind, or might have been the enemy. We learned to sleep with one eye open, if we slept at all. His voice steadied as he went on. He spoke of nights soaked in rain, of boots rotting on their feet, of hunger gnawing deeper than fear. He spoke of brothers who never came home, men with jokes that still lived in his memory, men whose laughter still echoed in the trees. They gave us medals, Raymond said quietly, but they don't tell you what those medals weigh. It's not the medal, it's the faces. Every ribbon I ever got carried a face I never stopped seeing. The SEALs leaned in, eyes locked on him, jaws tight. These were men hardened by their own battles, men who had seen death up close. Yet in Raymond's words, they found themselves stripped raw. One SEAL blinked rapidly, his lips pressed thin. Another shifted in his chair, clearing his throat, pretending to study the candle flame, but there was no hiding it. One by one, the toughest men in the room began to tear up, because they understood. They knew their own courage hadn't been born from nowhere. It had been inherited from men like Raymond, men who bled in jungles before modern rifles, before night vision goggles, before body armor that could stop a bullet. They were standing on the shoulders of ghosts, and as Raymond spoke, the ghosts filled the room. The laughter of young soldiers, the silence after a firefight, the thunder of helicopters that never made it back. All of it lived again, flickering in the eyes of those who listened. No one checked their phones. No one dared interrupt. Even the other diners leaned closer, pretending to sip their wine while eavesdropping on history itself. Raymond never boasted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for thanks. He just told the truth. And the truth hit harder than any speech, harder than any sermon. When he finished, his shoulders sagged, as if the telling itself had drained the last ounce of strength from his frail body. The room was quiet once more, but it was not the silence of judgment this time. It was the silence of reverence. The scarred SEAL raised his glass. "To Sergeant Raymond Douglas," he said, voice thick. "The man who paved the road we walk." The others lifted their glasses, eyes shining, and in that moment, the old soldier was no longer invisible. He was immortal. The dinner had turned into something no one could have predicted. The clinking of forks and knives had given way to quiet reverence, a stillness that hung heavy in the air. Around the table, the 6 Navy SEALs sat like sentries, listening with unwavering respect as Sergeant Raymond Douglas finished his story. And then, as if on cue, the restaurant manager arrived. He had heard the whispers, the shifting tide in the dining room, the story of the man who had once been humiliated at his doorstep. Nervous, he adjusted his tie and walked over, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "Sergeant Douglas," he began, his voice polite but trembling at the edges. "We would be honored to cover your meal tonight, on the house." For a moment, the offer seemed kind, generous even. Some of the guests nodded approvingly, thinking this would heal the wound, but Raymond's reaction stunned them. The old man shook his head slowly, his eyes steady but filled with something deeper than pride, conviction. His voice, though fragile, carried across the room with the clarity of a bell. "I'm not here for a free meal, son. I never asked for charity. I just wanted a warm place to sit. I'm not trying to make trouble." The words pierced the air sharper than any reprimand. The manager froze, the practiced smile slipping off his face. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others swallowed hard, realizing the truth of his statement. Before the silence could grow unbearable, one of the SEALs leaned forward. His voice was low, but each word landed like a hammer. "He didn't ask for a handout. He earned this." Another SEAL slammed his palm against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Hell, we should all be paying him for this table." The manager stood straighter, his face pale but resolute. "You're right. I'm sorry. Sergeant." "Niare." The words weren't enough. Everyone knew it. The shame in the room was suffocating. And yet, the atmosphere was not one of despair. It was one of revelation. For the first time, the other diners understood they were in the presence of something far greater than money, prestige, or luxury. They were in the presence of sacrifice. The rest of the meal passed in a hush. The seals continued to ask questions, drawing out more fragments of Raymond's life, not because they needed the stories, but because they wanted the man to feel seen, to feel honored. Every laugh, every tear, every silence became a thread binding them together. And then the plates were cleared. The candles burned lower. The night drew to a close. Raymond rose quietly, his frail frame bending under the weight of years. He reached for his cap, clutching it as if preparing to vanish into the night once more. He tried to slip away unnoticed, his steps soft, almost apologetic. But the seals were watching. They rose in unison, blocking his path like a wall of granite. "Where are you going, Sergeant?" one asked. Raymond avoided their eyes. His answer was quiet, almost embarrassed. "Back to the shelter. It's not far." The seal shook his head firmly. "Not anymore. You're coming with us." Raymond blinked, confused. "To where?" The scarred seal stepped closer, his voice unyielding yet tender. "Home." For a moment, the old soldier didn't understand. Home? He hadn't spoken that word in years. He hadn't felt it in decades. To him, home was just a memory of voices long gone, photographs fading in dusty boxes, letters tucked away in drawers no one opened anymore. But when he looked into their eyes, he saw something he thought had been buried forever. Belonging, family, brotherhood. His lips trembled. "Boys, you don't have to." "We do," the seal interrupted. "Because you carried the weight before us. Because you marched through jungles so we could walk on paved ground. Because every freedom we have is written in the sweat and blood of men like you." The other seals closed in around him, not trapping him, but shielding him. One slipped off his jacket and draped it over Raymond's shoulders, covering the damp coat that clung to his bones. Another steadied him by the arm, his grip firm but gentle. Together, they guided him out of the restaurant. The rain was still falling, soft but relentless, painting the city in silver streaks. But Raymond did not feel it. He was surrounded, protected, by 6 shadows moving as one, their jackets stretched out to shield him from the storm. Other patrons had followed them to the door, watching in silence. Some wiped tears from their cheeks, others simply stood frozen, realizing they had just witnessed something that would outlive them all. Raymond was led to one of their trucks, a military green beast that seemed out of place against the neon lights of the city. The seals opened the door with reverence, as though preparing a seat not for a passenger, but for a hero. Raymond hesitated at the step, his thin frame trembling. "I don't want to be a burden," he whispered. The scarred seal looked him dead in the eye. "You could never be a burden. You're the reason we are who we are." With that, they lifted him gently into the vehicle. One sat beside him, another in front, the rest surrounding him like an honor guard. And as the truck rumbled into the night, rain drumming on its roof, there was no applause, no spotlight, no audience. Only the quiet, unshakable truth. Real warriors never abandon their own. For Raymond, it was the first time in years that he didn't feel forgotten. He didn't feel invisible. He felt home. The rain followed them into the night, but it could not drown the silence that had settled over everyone who witnessed the scene. The truck disappeared down the slick streets, carrying Sergeant Raymond Douglas into a new chapter of his life, not one marked by medals, or speeches, or ceremonies, but by something far more powerful. Brotherhood. Inside that vehicle, there were no cameras waiting, no journalists scribbling notes, no flashes exploding to capture the moment for headlines. What unfolded was not staged for likes or applause. It was not theater. It was real. 6 Navy SEALs had stood up. Not because it would make them heroes on social media, but because they already understood what heroism meant. It wasn't about being seen. It was about never letting one of their own be forgotten. And that was the truth of that night. Respect is not measured in headlines or broadcast to the world. It is carved in silence, in actions no one claps for, in loyalty that doesn't seek recognition. As the rain poured harder, the city swallowed the truck's taillights, but the lesson lingered in the steakhouse long after the door had closed. The diners returned to their meals, but the food tasted different now. The wine didn't sparkle quite the same. because once you've witnessed a truth that deep, luxury feels shallow. Some whispered apologies to themselves. Some made promises they would never forget. A few even raised glasses quietly, toasting a man who had already vanished into the storm, but who had left behind a weight heavier than any metal. Raymond, sitting in the truck surrounded by warriors decades younger than him, felt something stir inside his chest. He hadn't asked for a free meal. He hadn't asked for pity. All he wanted was a chair, a place to rest. Instead, he was given something priceless. Dignity returned, honor restored, brotherhood reborn. He realized then that he had never been alone. Even in the darkest nights of the jungle, when the rain swallowed every sound and the trees whispered death in the shadows, he had not been alone. And he wasn't alone now. The SEAL beside him leaned forward, speaking barely above the hum of the engine. "You carried us before we were even born. Sergeant, don't think for a second we've forgotten." Raymond turned to him, his eyes glistening. "Boys, you make me feel like I still matter." "You do," came the reply. "More than you'll ever know." The old man lowered his gaze, overwhelmed. No cameras, no speeches, just words heavy with truth. And that was the final revelation of the night. Heroes don't always arrive in uniforms with medals shining. They don't stand on podiums or bask in applause. Sometimes they slip quietly into a restaurant, soaking wet, hungry only for a moment of warmth. And sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't a battle fought with guns or fists. It's the silence of men standing tall for a forgotten brother. Because real strength doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. Real strength moves quietly, shields someone else, and walks into the storm without asking for thanks. In a world obsessed with status, with money, with titles, it is easy to forget that character outlives all of it. Wealth fades, fame disappears, power crumbles, but sacrifice, true sacrifice, echoes forever. Raymond Douglas walked into that steakhouse invisible. He walked out immortal, and those who saw it will never forget. News of that night never made headlines, but it spread in whispers, shared from table to table, family to family, soldier to soldier, in veteran halls. Raymond's name was spoken with reverence. On quiet evenings, diners who had been there told the story to their children, not as gossip, but as a lesson. The image of 6 Navy SEALs rising in silence became a symbol that respect and loyalty outlast time, fame, and fortune. Raymond himself never sought recognition, yet his story lived on, proof that true honor doesn't fade. It multiplies, carried forward by those who remember.